Hello there. Welcome to the recording of the STOP Formula Grant Program Progress Reporting Forms. This recording is intended for STOP state administrators. If you are a STOP subgrantee, there is a separate recording intended just for you, available on our website, vawamei.org. Thank you for accessing our recording. In this session, we hope to help STOP administrators understand the overall reporting process, understand how to respond to questions on the STOP Administrator Annual Progress Reporting Form, and learn how to guide your subgrantees in completing reports and what to look for in your review of those subgrantee reports. Before we talk about the STOP Administrator Progress Reporting Form, here is an overview of the Administrator Reporting Cycle. You as a STOP State Administrator must download your Progress Reporting Form from the Grant Management System, or GMS. These STOP Administrator reports are due to GMS by March 30th of every year. After you fill out your progress reporting form and re-upload it into the grant management system, your program specialist at OVW reviews them, and they come to us at VAWA MEI, where they get turned into reports that we send back to OVW. The subgrantee reporting cycle looks a little different. STOP subgrantee reports are due to VAWA MEI by March 30th of every year. However, STOP subgrantees do not submit their reports directly to us, but rather first to you, their STOP administrator. We encourage you as the STOP administrator to allow yourself time to review those subgrantee reports before you submit them to us at VAWA MEI. For example, many administrators set February 15th or March 1st as the day subgrantee reports are due to them. This gives them time to look at each of those subgrantee reports and ensure that the data is reported as accurately and thoroughly as you are able to. After you submit those subgrantee reports to us here at VAWA MEI, we carefully review each of those reports, looking for any data that we think might be missing or might have been mistakenly reported. For example, any activities that were not directly supported with STOP subgrant funding or required a grant match should not be reflected on the progress reporting forms. And if we see something like that, we will be reaching back out to you as the STOP state administrator to ask about that data. This is why, if you allow yourself time to review each of those subgrantee reports before submitting them to us at VAWA MEI, it will save you time in the long run because you will have fewer questions from us that you will need to review and respond to later in the year. After we've thoroughly cleaned and analyzed the data, we turn it into reports that we then send both to OVW and back to you as the STOP administrator. Now we will go over the STOP administrator's form. The beginning of the form asks for general information, including the current date, which should be the date that you submit the form into the grant management system, the current reporting period, which should be the calendar year for which you are reporting data, as well as contact information for you, the STOP state administrator. The next question on the form, 6A, asks for a specific breakdown of STOP program funds awarded to subgrantees and the amount of funds returned during the current reporting period. In the very first column, you will choose the federal fiscal year and write the federal grant number for the first grant that you are reporting on funds returned and funds reawarded. In the second column, you will report the amount of grant funds returned unused by subgrantees during the current reporting period. In the third column, you will report the amount awarded to subgrantees during the current reporting period. And in the fourth column, you will report that percentage of total returned. So the percentage is the federal fiscal year amount returned during the current reporting period divided by the original federal fiscal year total funds. For example, in the current reporting period of January 1st through December 31st, 2019, subgrantees returned $55,000 of the $1,155,000 of federal fiscal year 2017 funds that you awarded during previous reporting periods. You awarded this $55,000 again during this reporting period. You make your awards in January, so you also awarded federal fiscal year 2018 funds during this reporting period. You awarded $975,000 of your $1.1 million federal fiscal year 2018 funds during this reporting period, and none were returned unused. Now I will show you what that would look like reported. So of the federal fiscal year 2017 funding, you would choose 2017 in that first column. You would write the grant number in the next column. And then in the amount of grant funds returned unused by subgrantees, you would report $55,000 because that's the amount returned during the current reporting period. And you would report $55,000 also in the amount awarded to subgrantees during the current reporting period because you also reawarded this money that was returned during this current reporting period. To get the percentage of the federal fiscal year the percentage of the total returned for this fiscal year, you will take that $55,000 that was returned and divide it by the total $1,155,000 that was originally part of the federal fiscal year 2017 STOP grant funding. And you would report 4.76 in this percentage question. For 2018 funding, you awarded $975,000 of your $1.1 million total 2018 funding, and none were returned unused. So you would choose 2018 in the federal fiscal year drop-down box. You would enter the federal grant number in the next box, and then in the column asking for the amount of grant funds returned unused by subgrantees, you would write 0 because none were returned unused. In the amount awarded to subgrantees during the current reporting period, you would report $975,000. Because $0 were returned unused, the percentage of total returned that you would enter would be 0. In question 6B, report on funds returned in question 6A by federal fiscal year and also by category of subgrantee returning funds. So for any of the federal fiscal year allocation that was returned unused by subgrantees during the current reporting period, provide the amount returned from each category that any funding was returned from for that federal fiscal year. For example, victim services, law enforcement, prosecution. So you'll be breaking out that amount returned unused according to the category it was originally awarded to. The total of categories for each federal fiscal year should match the amount returned for that federal fiscal year that is reported in question 6A. In question 6C, reallocation of funds returned, report on how the funds that were returned were reallocated by federal fiscal year and by category. Again, the total of the categories for each federal fiscal year should match the amount awarded for that federal fiscal year in question 6A. The percentages here are automatically populated, so you do not need to calculate those yourself. In question 7A, allocation categories, report on the funds awarded to subgrantees by federal fiscal year and by category. The totals for each federal fiscal year minus administrative costs should equal the amounts awarded to subgrantees from that same federal fiscal year in question 6A. If the required percentage allocations have not been reached, please describe why in question 7B. Questions 8A and 8B ask about culturally specific awards. Both of these questions are operating off of a definition of culturally specific community-based organizations. That is three-part. One, to qualify as a culturally specific community-based organization, they must have a focus on any underserved population. Two, this organization must not merely be providing services to an underserved population, but be providing culturally competent services designed to meet specific needs of that population. And thirdly, at a minimum, this organization has some expertise or demonstrated capacity to work effectively on domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking, or acquires that expertise through collaboration with another entity. You will report the culturally specific victim services awards in question 8A by federal fiscal year and by category. Also indicate which subgrantees received these awards in your subgrants list. In question 8B, discuss these awards. For example, if you did not meet the 10% of victim services awards requirement, or you can describe any awards made to culturally specific organizations that also received sexual assault funds. Question 9A and 9B asks about sexual assault awards by federal fiscal year and by category. You should also indicate which subgrantees received these awards in your subgrants list. In question 9B, discuss any challenges in meeting the 20% set-aside requirement for sexual assault awards in question 9B. In question 10, report the percentage of allocation types by type of victimization. And in question 11, it asks you to attach a separate document to this report providing information on all active subgrants for the current reporting period. The last portion of the staff administrator's form is the narrative portion. All administrators need to answer questions 12 through 18 on every single administrator's progress report that you submit. Among these narrative questions are a handful of new narrative questions as of 2019. They are all specifically asking about set-asides and special subgrant focuses. So question 13 asks about subgrants used for supporting incarcerated victims, developing legislation, prevention and education, or improving response to victims who have limited access to services due to their sexual orientation or gender identity. Question 14 asks you to describe successes and challenges in implementing Jessica Gonzalez victim assistance within local law enforcement agencies. Question 15 asks you to describe your successes and challenges in implementing the Crystal Judson Domestic Violence Protocol Program in the required annual training. Question 16 asks you to describe your successes and challenges in complying with the Prison Rape Elimination Act and to discuss staff funds awarded to address PREA compliance. Question 17 asks you to report on your state or territory's efforts to recognize and address the needs of underserved populations. And question 18 asks you to describe the most significant areas of remaining need in your state or territory. Questions 19 through 22 are optional, but they provide opportunities for you to expand on the changes that Stop Subgrant funding has made in communities across your state or territory, as well as to provide any additional information you would like us or OVW to know about your use of STOP program funds or the effectiveness of that funding. Now, before you are able to submit your form back into the grant management system, you will need to successfully validate it. To do this, you scroll to the very end of the progress reporting form, and you see this small gray Validate button. You must click this. You might get an error with a red X on it. If you get an error like this, it is something you will need to resolve before you're able to successfully validate the form and therefore able to successfully upload it into GMS and submit it for that year. You might also get yellow exclamation point warnings. If you get one of these yellow triangles with an exclamation point, you can still submit your form with this type of an error, but it's flagging something that it thinks might have been reported in error. So it's worth going and looking at that section to make sure that the data is reported the way you want it to be. Finally, the third type of pop-up you can get is one that says your form has been successfully validated and is ready for submission. This is the pop-up you need to get in order to be able to successfully submit your progress reporting form back into the grant management system. Now we will talk about the subgrantee progress reporting form. STAP data matters because it is the opportunity for administrators and subgrantees to communicate with OVW and share the work and success stories from communities around your state or territory. It is an opportunity to help OVW understand the scope of domestic and sexual violence. And it is also the primary way that VAWA's effectiveness is measured and reported on. The subgrantee data that we receive here at VAWA MEI is turned into biannual STOP formula reports to Congress. A few general tips for successful data reporting include reading the separate instructions, as these will help interpret every single question on the progress reporting form, using the reporting tools on the VAWA MEI website, which includes helpful hints and frequently asked questions. In general, making sure that subgrantees report in the other category only as a last resort, and that if something can fit into an existing category, it be reported there. Encouraging subgrantees to use optional information sections to capture their successes, clarify the data, and provide more details. And finally, validating the form when it is completed. The first section of the form, A1, is general grant information, which simply asks a variety of questions about the subgrantee filling out the progress reporting form and the type of agency that they work at. Section A2, staff information, is where any and all individuals working on the STOP subgrant should be reported according to the amount of time that was paid with STOP subgrant funding or supported by required grant match. So if any staff were working using grant funds or required match during the current reporting period, the subgrantee should be filling out the staff section. A few general tips for reviewing the staff section. Only STOP subgrant funded staff and required match should be reported in this section. Staff should be reported in full-time equivalents, also known as FTEs. One full-time equivalent is one person working full-time for the entire year and 100% supported by STOP funding or required match, or both together. Staff should be reported by activity performed rather than by job title. So if you're looking at a subgrantee's progress report and you see a high number of FTEs in one single category, such as victim advocate, it might be because the FTE was not split down by activity performed. Perhaps that FTE would be better broken out across the translator, victim advocate, and trainer categories. We encourage you to check that staff FTEs are prorated for the 12-month period, because if anything less than the full 12 months was paid with STOP subgrant funding or required match, that FTE should be prorated down accordingly. So if you know that a subgrantee was not using funds until partway through the year, the FTE should be prorated down to reflect that and should not be reported as one full-time equivalent. Here's a handy cheat sheet for calculating FTEs. As I said, the calculation should be based on the entire year, or 52 weeks, or the 2,080 working hours in the 12-month reporting period. So if you're trying to help a subgrantee figure out how their FTEs should be reported, or you're checking their progress report after it's been submitted to you, if you have either the total number of hours worked in a week or the total number of hours worked across the entire year, it's very easy to calculate the amount the FTE should be represented as. For example, if a law enforcement officer was paid with stop grant funding for 20 hours every week during the reporting period, they should be reported as 0.50 FTEs under the law enforcement category. Here's an example. If a county receives a STOP subgrant that was used to fund one full-time prosecutor, and they worked on the grant the entire year, and their salary was 100% funded by the subgrant, and then also on this same subgrant, another full-time prosecutor's salary was 25% supported by the required grant match, you would add these two amounts together to get the appropriate FTE under prosecutor, which would be 1.25, because that's the portion of time that was worked on the grant and supported with STOP subgrant funding and required match. The next section on the form, Section B, Purpose Areas, has been expanded recently in 2019 to include all the additional purpose areas that were and all the changes made by the VAWA 2013 reauthorization. Subgrantees should select any purpose areas that the STOP subgrant addressed during the current reporting period, and you might want to review these carefully as they have changed recently. The next section on the form, C1, Training, should be filled out if STOP subgrant funding or required match was used to support training activities during the current reporting period. In the first question, question 11, subgrantees should report the total training events provided by STOP program funded staff or directly supported by STOP program subgrant funds. It should not include training provided to STOP program funded staff, as that is considered professional development for the purposes of this program. Each training event is determined by each separate audience. So one training event could be a 3-day conference if it were delivered to the same audience across all 3 days. Or it could be a 30-minute meeting or class. In question 12, the subgrantee should report the total people trained at these events that were supported with STOP subgrant funding. They should be reported according to their professional category. For the purposes of the STOP subgrantee progress reporting form, training is considered an activity intended to help professionals or those acting in the role of a professional to improve their response to victims. So, for example, community members should not be reported as people trained because for the purposes of this form, that would actually not be considered training. Only professionals should be reported in the training section. If there are pre-professional students being trained, such as students in nursing school, they should be reported according to the professional class that they are going to join. So, for example, nurses should be reported under the health professional category. The next section on the form is the education section, which is a new section as of 2019. To help clarify the difference between training versus education, if you consider that training is considered for professionals to help support them in their role in the system, education is providing general information that will increase public awareness of sexual assault, domestic violence, and stalking. So most students and all community members should be reported in the education section, not the training section, if they are receiving information from a STOP subgrantee during the current reporting period. This new section, Section C2, asks for the total number of education events that were supported by STOP program funded staff or directly supported with STOP program funds, and then to check off which groups were educated with STOP program funding in question 16. Section C3, Coordinated Community Response, is where subgrantees should check off any and all different agencies that they had contact with during the current reporting period, and they should check off the most frequent level of contact that they had during that reporting period. In Section C4, Policies and Legislation, subgrantees should fill out this section if STOP program funds were used to develop, substantially revise, or implement policies or protocols, or to develop or promote state, local, or tribal legislation and policies during the current reporting period. Everything in this section are checkboxes, and subgrantees should check all that apply to grant-funded activities. In question 20, there have been some categories added in 2019 to reflect changes wrought by the VAWA 2013 reauthorization. Some of those new additional categories added to question 20 include appropriate response to victim survivors in correctional settings, sexual assault evidence collection kits, appropriate response to victim survivors whose sexual orientation or gender identity affects their access to services, and homicide prevention. In question 21, legislation and policies, an entirely new question and a narrative question, subgrantees should describe activities related to the development of or promotion of state, local, or tribal legislation and policies. Subgrantees should fill out Section C5, Products, if STOP program funds were used to develop or substantially revise products during the current reporting period. There is no longer a space for subgrantees to report the number distributed, so if STOP subgrant funds were only used to distribute but not develop or substantially revise a product, it should not be reported in the product section. In Section C6, Data Collection and Communication Systems, subgrantees should indicate if STOP program funds were used to develop, install, or expand data collection or communication systems during the current reporting period. These are also select all that apply boxes, where subgrantees should check any usage of STOP program funds for data collection in question 24, and any purposes of that data collection or communication system that was invested in with STOP subgrant funding in question 25. In Section C7, Specialized Units, the subgrantee should check yes and fill out this section if STOP program funds were used for specialized units in the criminal justice system during the current reporting period. Again, these are checkboxes, and they can simply indicate which types of specialized units apply for the current reporting period, as well as the victimizations addressed by those STOP-funded specialized units. In Section C8, System Improvement, subgrantees should indicate if STOP program funds were used for system improvement during the current reporting period, and they can check all that apply Section D, Victim Services/Legal Services. STOP subgrantees should fill out the Victim Services section if STOP program funds were used to provide victim services during the current reporting period. The first question, question 29, asks about the total number of primary victim survivors served, partially served, and seeking services who were not served. Most of the data in this whole section, including this question 29, is congressionally mandated. Subgrantees should be sure to provide only information that represents victim survivors served and services provided with STOP program funding. The victim services numbers should not reflect all victims served by their entire agency, but only those served by STOP-funded victim services staff or services directly supported with STOP subgrant funding. All victim services should be reported in this section, even if they are provided by victim services staff working within a criminal justice agency, such as law enforcement or prosecution. The victim services section spans questions 29 through 37, and the legal services section, which is new in 2019, spans questions 38 through 42. To report any victim in the Victim Services or Legal Services section. They must have met 3 different criteria. They must have requested or accepted a service during the current reporting period. That service must be STOP subgrant funded. And the victim survivor must be a primary victim of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. In the first question in this section, 29, the definition of victim served is that the person requesting services received all services that they requested that are provided by STOP funds. A person is counted as partially served if they received some but not all of the services they requested that are supported by STOP funds. Finally, a person is counted as not served if they did not receive any of the requested services that are provided by STOP funds. So, any services that are provided with a different funding source should not be considered for the purposes of deciding whether a person counts as served, partially served, or not served. We have some examples to help clarify this. If a victim whose ex-husband has been charged with stalking comes into the prosecutor's office to get information about the criminal process, and the STOP-funded victim assistant explains the process to her, she then asks the assistant to attend the arraignment with her, but the victim witness assistant is already scheduled to be in another court on that date. This victim received information from the STOP-funded assistant, but not the other service she requested that are normally provided under the STOP program subgrant. How should this victim be reported? Served, partially served, or not served under the category of stalking. In this case, the victim survivor should be reported as partially served because she sought grant-funded services, and the program provides some, but not all, of those services with STOP subgrant funding during the current reporting period. In our second example, a woman is sexually assaulted in a domestic violence incident by her live-in boyfriend. A police officer who responded to the incident has called the STOP-funded hotline on behalf of the victim, asking if an advocate will accompany the victim to the hospital during her examination. There is no advocate available to do this, and it is a service this program is funded to do under the STOP program subgrant. How should this victim be reported? This victim would be reported as C, not served, under the category of sexual assault, because she saw a grant-funded service, but the program could not provide the service that was requested. It's important to keep in mind that even though this victim experienced both sexual assault and domestic violence, she can only be reported once in question 29, and therefore we recommend reporting her in this situation under sexual assault because that primary victimization was what drove her to seek services. In question 30, which is a new question as of 2019, report any victim survivors who were new during the current reporting period. So for each victim survivor reported in 29A and 29B, report the number who began receiving STOP program-funded services during the current reporting period. So if this is a program's first reporting period using STOP funds, all victim survivors they served with that subgrant should be reported in 29A and that are reported in 29A and 29B should be reported in question 30. Question 31, additional victimizations, is also a new question as of 2019. For each victim reported in question 29A or 29B, any additional types of victimizations for which those victims received STOP program-funded services during the current reporting period can be captured now. Be sure to report a victim only once under each additional victimization, but you can report any and all victimizations that they experienced and for which they received STOP-funded services. In question 32, secondary victims served. Report any secondary victims, children, siblings, spouses, relatives, etc., anyone indirectly affected by domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking who received STOP program-funded services during the current reporting period. If you simply know that a person has a child, but you did not provide that child STOP program-funded services, you would not count them as a secondary victim served. In question 33, reasons not served, partially served, indicate whether each reason checked applies to victim survivors partially served, not served, or both. One update to this progress reporting form is that the revised table now has two columns of checkboxes, one for partially served and a separate one for not served. So if you're reporting any victim survivors as partially served or not served, you want to make sure, if your subgrantee is reporting any victims as partially served or not served, you want to make sure that they have checked off a reason that they were partially served or not served. Oftentimes, other entries indicate a misunderstanding of how to report victims, including a victim did not return, victim refused services, services not provided by our program, and could not locate victim. In all of these cases, that's actually a victim that should not be being reported at all, because if we refer back to the criteria, subgrantees should only be reporting on victims who were primary victims, who were requesting or accepting a STOP grant-funded service. So if the victim refuses, they should not be reported. In question 34, subgrantees should report demographic information for every single primary victim survivor that they reported as served or partially served in 29A and 29B. If they do not know some of the demographic information for a particular person, it is fine for subgrantees to use the unknown category as much as they need or want to. A couple of updates to the demographics question include the additional category of some other race, ethnicity, or origin under the race and ethnicity demographics section, transgender or gender nonconforming under the gender section of this question, and changing the age category from the youngest age category from 13 to 17 to 11 to 17 to represent the changes wrought by VAWA 2013 reauthorization. There are also new other demographics sections, including lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer individuals, people who are deaf or hard of hearing, and people who are in correctional settings. These other demographic questions should never be directly asked by subgrantees. For example, they should not be listed on intake forms. They should just be reported if subgrantees learn of victims' other demographic statuses in the course of providing services to them. Question 35, victim-survivor relationship to offender by victimization, is another opportunity for subgrantees to report all of the different relationships and victimizations that a victim they served might have experienced. In question 36, victim services. Report the number of victims that received each type of service. It's very important that there be a sufficient number of services reported for the total number of victims served reported in 29A and 29B, because if there are fewer services reported than victims reported as served, it's an indication that perhaps something about the victim served reported is inaccurate. For example, if they are not receiving a STOP grant-funded victim service, they should not be reported as served in 29A or 29B. One change to this question that you will notice if you have looked at previous subgrantee progress reporting forms is that there is now an additional column that asks for the number of times a service was provided. This number of times a service was provided should be an aggregate representing all of the times any victim was provided a service. So for example, if 10 victims each received counseling 3 times during the current reporting period, 30 should be reported in the number of times service was provided. Another change is that there is no longer a civil legal assistance category, because all civil legal assistance, also known as assistance provided by an attorney or paralegal on legal matters should now be reported under the Legal Services section. (36B) Shelter Services asks for the number of victim survivors, the number of family members provided emergency shelter or transitional housing, and the total number of bed nights provided during the current reporting period. Bed nights is calculated by multiplying the number of victim survivors and family members, so the total people housed, by the total number of nights they stayed. So for example, if one survivor stays with their 3 children for a total of 2 nights in your subgrantee's STOP grant funded emergency shelter, you would take those 4 people total provided emergency shelter and multiply it by the 3 nights that they stayed together in the grant funded shelter, and the total number of bed nights that should be reported is 12. It's very important when you're reviewing the subgrantee progress reporting forms to make sure that they're only reporting shelter services if STOP subgrant funding directly supported those shelter services. It should not include all shelter services provided by their organization, but only those services provided with STOP subgrant funding. The same goes for question 36C, hotline support information and referral. Hotline calls, for example, should only be reported in question 36C if STOP subgrant funding directly supported the phone line or the staff time answering those hotline calls. In question 36C, victim witness notification and outreach, the subgrantee should report unsolicited letters, phone calls, or visits that were supported with STOP subgrant funding. In question 37, protection orders, subgrantees should only be reporting protection orders requested or granted if STOP program-funded victim services staff provided assistance to victim survivors in obtaining those protection orders. If an attorney or paralegal assisted victims in obtaining those protection orders, they should not be reported in victim services because they will be reported in legal services as a legal issue. Which brings us to the legal services subsection. This section is only for legal assistance provided by STOP-funded attorneys or paralegals. If the STOP subgrant did not fund attorneys or paralegals, this section should not be filled out. Because this is a recent change, it might be an area where you should pay particular attention while you're reviewing subgrant reports to ensure that this section is not filled out if a STOP subgrant did not directly support attorneys or paralegals. In question 38, legal issues, subgrantees should be reporting the number of primary victim survivors from 29A and 29B who had legal issues addressed during the current reporting period. The number of victim survivors is what's being reported, so each category of legal issue should be an unduplicated count of the total victims receiving assistance for that type of legal issue. For question section B, family law matters, and G, immigration matters, provide an unduplicated count of victims who received assistance in one or more of the subcategories listed under each of these general categories. So for example, in B, family law matters, if one victim survivor was assisted with divorce, and that same victim survivor was assisted with custody and visitation, 1 is what should be reported on the line of B, as well as the line of I, divorce, and II, custody visitation. Because that overall family law matter category should be an unduplicated count across each of the issues, subcategories. In question 39 and question 40, report an unduplicated count of victim survivors who received assistance with at least one legal issue that was reported in question 38. If they received assistance with more than one legal issue, report them in both question 39 and question 40. 39 asks for the total number of victim survivors who received assistance with legal issues. And question 40 asks for the number of victim survivors who received assistance with multiple legal issues. In question 41, legal outcomes, report an outcome for all cases closed or all issues resolved during the current reporting period for which services were provided by STOP program-funded attorneys or paralegals. The next section on the form, E1, law enforcement, should only be filled out if the STOP subgrant supported a law enforcement officer or a prosecution-based investigator. Question 43, activities, should reflect only activities directly supported with STOP grant funding or required match. For example, if you know that a subgrantee is funding half of a law enforcement officer with STOP subgrant funding, only half of that law enforcement officer's total activities for the year should be reported in question 43, activities. If an advocate is employed by or located at the law enforcement agency, but STOP funds are not supporting law enforcement activities, those advocates' activities should be reported under the Victim Services section, Section D, and nothing should be reported in Law Enforcement section, Section E1. In question 43, if the STOP subgrant supports a prosecution-based investigator, report the cases investigated by that person in question 43, as well as any arrests or referrals to the prosecutor that occurred as a result of those STOP-funded investigations. So if you know that a subgrantee is reporting a prosecution-based investigator, and they are not funding a prosecutor, that subgrantee should not be reporting in the prosecution section and should only be reporting those investigators' activities in the law enforcement section. Section C2, prosecution, should only be filled out if the STOP subgrant was used to directly support a prosecutor, or if a prosecutor was supported with required match funding. Only STOP program-funded prosecution activities should be reported in this section. Again, if a victim assistant is located at the prosecutor's office, but grant funds are not supporting a prosecutor, that assistance activity should be reported in Section D, Victim Services, and the prosecution section should be left blank. In the prosecution section, cases should be characterized by the most serious offense and may include numerous charges or counts. In most instances, one case will refer to one victim, one offender, and one incident. Cases should be reported as domestic violence regardless of the actual charge if they're related to a domestic violence case. So even if the charge is assault or vandalism, if it's part of a DV case, it should be reported throughout the prosecution section as a domestic violence case. Sexual assault cases could include rape, gross sexual misconduct, and more. In question 47A, cases received, accepted, and declined. Report the number of cases received, accepted, declined, and transferred during the current reporting period. There's also now the option to report any cases that were referred for federal prosecution, for example, firearms charges or interstate protection orders. In question 37B, the subgrantee should report all reasons for declining cases. So the total number of cases declined that the subgrantee reported should match the total number of reasons for declining cases listed in question 47B. There should not be more reasons reported than more cases declined. And there should be at least one reason reported for each case declined. In question 48, disposition of cases, report the disposition of all cases resolved during the current reporting period, and subgrantees should be reporting them by the highest crime category that applies. So for example, If a prosecutor is trying a case that includes both misdemeanor and felony DV charges, and that case winds up being pled to the misdemeanor assault and the felony dropped, it should still be reported under domestic violence felony, but under the category pled to lesser charge in lower category. If, for example, a Class A felony rape case was tried and the defendant was found guilty of the rape, then the subgrantee should report that case under sexual assault felony, guilty as charged. One more disclaimer about question 48, disposition of cases, is just that each case should only be reported as one disposition, regardless of the number of charges involved. And that is, again, because it should be reported by the highest charge. The next section, section E3, courts, should only be reported if your stop subgrantee used subgrant funding to directly support court's activities. If an advocate is located at the court, those activities should be reported in Section D, Victim Services, not in the court section. In the court section, subgrantees no longer need to collect data on the number of new criminal cases for the purposes of this progress reporting form, as there is no longer a question to report that data. In question 54, disposition of criminal cases, subgrantees should again report dispositions of VAWA-funded cases that were resolved during the current reporting period. As you will notice, there are fewer ways to capture the convictions, and instead convictions are all reported together. In question 55, judicial monitoring, offenders reviewed and individual hearing conducted should be reported only if they are stop subgrant funded activities. The number of review hearings is equal to the number of individual hearings held for each offender, and so it should always be more, potentially significantly more, than the number of offenders reviewed. In question 56, disposition of violations, subgrantees should report the total number of cases in which there were dispositions of violations during the current reporting period. If there is no disposition by the end of the reporting period, they should not be reporting in this question. In section E4, probation and parole, subgrantees should only be reporting in this section if stop subgrant funding directly supported probation and parole activities. In question 61, number of offenders, subgrantees should report the total number of offenders monitored, and they no longer need to report new and continuing offenders separately. In question 62, monitoring activities, only those that occurred during the current reporting period should be reported, and they can now, as of 2019 reporting, include electronic monitoring. In question 63, disposition of violations, the subgrantees should report the total number of cases in which there were dispositions of violations during the current reporting period. A violation does not have to have occurred during this reporting period, only the disposition. A case may be counted more than once if there are multiple violations. In section E5, Betterer Intervention Program, subgrantees should only be reporting in this section if stop grant funding directly supported BIP activities. Question 66 asks for the total number of offenders in the subgrantee's BIP program, and subgrantees no longer need to separately report new and continuing offenders, just the total. In question question 67 outcomes, offenders should only be reported here if they completed or were terminated from the grant-funded program. If offenders are continuing in the program and you, as the stop administrator, see that written out in the other box, that line should actually be erased and they should only be reporting completed or terminated offenders during the current reporting period. In Section G, Narrative, subgrantees must answer questions 69 and 70 each reporting period. If either 69 or 70 are blank, you should encourage the subgrantee to fill out that question. At the end of the entire progress reporting form, there is another validation button. We highly encourage you to validate each subgrantee progress reporting form before submitting those forms to us at VAWA MEI. Again, if you hit the validate button and get a red X error, this is an error that must be resolved before the form can be successfully validated. These are the particular errors that you as staff administrator want to look out for before submitting subgrantee progress reporting forms, because any of these errors will definitely be something we at VAWA MEI will be reaching out to you to get corrected when we review the data ourselves. The yellow exclamation points are also good to look at because those flag common reporting discrepancies, such as very high numbers reported in the staff section. Finally, if you have any questions about how the subgrantees should be filling out their forms or how you can best train or provide technical assistance to your subgrantees, feel free to contact us at VAWA MEI. There are a couple ways you can do this, including asking us a question through our Contact Us form, as well as reaching out to us directly, and the next slide will have our contact information. Also available on our website is the Stop Subgrantee Progress Reporting Form and Instructions, the Administrator Reporting Form and Instructions, tools and resources on filling out both of these progress reports, the biennial discretionary and stop reports to Congress, and training dates and materials such as OBW updates on new reporting forms. Thank you for listening to our recording today. If you have any additional questions about the subgrantee progress reporting form or the administrator's progress reporting form, please feel free to reach out to us at VAWA MEI. If you have any questions about grant-funded activities, you should reach out to your OBW program specialist. If you need GMS support, such as you're having trouble downloading your administrator's progress reporting form from the GMS system, you should contact GMS support directly. Thank you, and have a great day.